The development of the bomber aircraft dramatically changed the face of warfare in the 20th century. World War I had seen the first use of heavy bombers to attack cities, but it was during World War II that air power was really applied on a massive strategic scale. In the European theatre, both Germany and the Allies used long-range heavy bombers to strike at the enemy's ability to sustain war rather than against his forces on the ground. The main thrust of this effort involved striking at military and industrial targets. The bomber also struck at cities in both Britain and Germany on an awful scale. As an instrument of terror, the bomber was unrivaled. Opposing Allied bomber forces were the hardened combat veterans of the Luftwaffe who put up ferocious resistance to these raids. They soon showed that the campaign would be long and grueling. Many thousands of airmen on all sides perished as the Allies battled the Luftwaffe for control of the skies. At the start of World War II, in September 1939, Britain's standard light bomber was the Bristol Blenheim. It flew the first RAF daylight bombing raid against Germany on the 4th of September 1939, but it was an outdated aircraft, and subsequent attacks by Blenheims proved to be very costly. RAF bombers of the time were only lightly armed, and worse still, they flew unescorted without any fighter protection. They were shot out of the skies by the defending German Messerschmitt fighters and anti-aircraft guns. The decision was soon taken to switch bombing attacks to night operations, but it was the Germans who would be the first to make good use of night operations. On the night of the 7th of September 1940, the German night bomber offensive against Britain, known as the Blitz, began. Various German bombers like the Heinkel HE-111 and the Junkers Ju-88s pounded the dock area of East London. The German High Command believed that repeated heavy attacks on London would cause the British to surrender. For more than 50 consecutive nights, the raids inflicted major civilian damage and casualties on cities in England such as London and Coventry. RAF defence was provided by night fighter versions of the Blenheim, but it proved to be largely ineffective against the bombers. The German bombers continued their ferocious onslaught. Night after night in cities across England, civilians would sit in their air raid shelters. Often they would emerge the next morning to find their homes or businesses destroyed. The Germans expected the effects on the British public to be overwhelming, so that pressure from them would cause the government to surrender. But the raids seemed to harden the resolve of the British public, and the strategy failed. The attacks continued for the rest of the year. At the end of 1940, a particularly heavy incendiary raid inflicted grievous damage on the historic buildings of London. The first few months of 1941 saw the attacks continue, but the RAF's defences were improving. The new, improved aircraft, such as the Bristol Beaufighter, which made effective use of radar to intercept the incoming bombers. The RAF were finally able to strike back and it was becoming obvious to the Germans that the morale of the British public was not wavering. By May 1941, the Germans were planning their assault on Russia, and the bulk of their bomber forces were removed from Western Europe to support that attack. The Blitz was finally over. Despite causing massive amounts of damage, the large-scale bombing had not affected the course of the war. The resilience of the British had won through. But in return, the RAF too was hitting targets in Germany. A trio of heavily armed four-engine bombers, the Stirling, Halifax and Lancaster, were carrying the war back to the German people. (1942) marked a watershed year for the British bombing effort. It saw the introduction of new equipment. Both the Lancaster and Halifax flew their first operational missions with new tactics, new technology in the form of navigational aids and radar, and new bombs in the form of heavier and heavier single bombs. The night of May the 30th, 31st, 1942 saw the first 1,000-bomber raid in the history of air warfare, when the RAF hit Cologne in Germany. Essen was hit 2 nights later, followed by Bremen on the night of the 25th and 26th of June, 1942. In spite of the loss of a total of around 120 bombers, these 3 raids caused significant damage and, more importantly, provided a tremendous boost in the morale for the beleaguered British people. With the widespread introduction of the Halifax and Lancaster, arguably the finest bomber of the war in the European theatre, the RAF could now go fully on the offensive against the Third Reich. One of the best known and most innovative bomber raids of World War II was the famous Dam Busters raid. The attack, named Operation Chastise, was designed to destroy a number of dams on the River Rhine. These contained hydroelectric power stations that supplied power to German industry in the Ruhr. It was felt a traditional attack wouldn't be able to cause enough damage to fracture the dams, so a new weapon had to be found. A British scientist, Barnes Wallis, had come up with a plan for a bomb, christened Upkeep, that would bounce along the surface of the water until it hit its target. This would call for a daring low-level attack by Lancaster bombers flying at extremely low level along the Rhine. On the 16th of May 1943, 19 Lancasters from 617 Squadron set off on the raid led by Wing Commander Guy Gibson. As the Lancasters dropped the bouncing mines, they had to climb away swiftly to avoid the enemy defenses. The raid was a success. The Möhne and Eder dams were breached, and considerable damage was done to the German industrial capacity. Of the 19 aircraft that left on the raid, only 11 returned. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, it was quickly decided the US Army Air Force would play a full part in the bomber effort against Germany. The first elements of the US 8th Bomber Command, which was to become the 8th Air Force, arrived in Britain in February 1942. By August, it was ready for action, and the first Flying Fortress raids, escorted by British fighters, were flown against targets in France. These continued for the remainder of 1942, with the B-17 being joined in October by another heavy bomber type, the B-24 Liberator. The first American strike against Germany took place on the 27th of January 1943, when the port of Wilhelmshaven was attacked. Each B-17 and B-24 was heavily armed, carrying up to 10 50 caliber machine guns placed around the aircraft to provide the necessary defense against German fighters. American tactics involved the use of box formations of bombers. By flying in such formations, each about 20 aircraft strong, the bombers could provide mutual protective covering fire. Initially, German fighters seemed to have difficulty in getting through the heavy fire of the American boxes, but the experienced Luftwaffe pilots soon realized that the American bombers were vulnerable to head-on attacks where they were not so well armed. New, more heavily armed German fighter variants also began to appear. In August 1943, US bombers began flying deep into Germany. This marked the start of one of the most savage aerial campaigns ever fought. The primary objective for Allied air forces was the progressive destruction and dislocation of the German military, industrial, and economic system. Large, long-distance daylight raids were repeatedly mounted on key targets, but the early American attacks suffered crippling losses. The first of these involved 2 raids against the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt in August and October 1943. A total of 120 B-17s were lost and a similar number badly damaged. Many of these targets were well beyond the range of escorting Spitfire and P-47 fighters. After they were forced to turn back, formations of 200 bombers and more were subject to continuous German fighter attack on the way to the target and on the return leg home.
3 planes, 9 o'clock, coming around. Keep your eye on them, boy. Coming around at 10.
Watch them, so keep your eyes open.
The only way to deal with fighters was other fighters, and the introduction of long-range escort fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-38 Lightning, and above all the magnificent P-51 Mustang finally turned the balance in favor of the Allies. Dubbed the Little Friends, these fighters finally had sufficient range to escort the bombers for the entire length of the mission. The Luftwaffe's main aim was to shoot down the bombers or disrupt their flight so that they dropped their warload early. It was the task of the 8th Air Force escorts to see that this didn't succeed. Pitched air battles resulted, with heavy fighter losses on both sides. But ultimately, the Germans were fighting a losing battle. The Allied strategic bomber offensive was overwhelming. It was a round-the-clock effort, mounted during the day by the Americans and at night by the British. In spite of the heavy losses, fighters, bombers and precious aircrew were quickly replaced. The Allied war machine was moving into a higher gear. Royal Air Force heavy bombers also joined in the attack against strategic maritime targets, such as surface vessels, which also threatened Allied shipping, and hardened concrete pens for the U-boats. In May 1944, RAF Lancaster heavy bombers attacked the German battleship Tirpitz. They used a new type of superweapon, a 12,000-pound bomb known as Tallboy. After 2 failed attempts due to smoke screens being lit by the Germans, the 3rd attempt resulted in the sinking of the battleship. At French Atlantic ports such as Brest, the Germans had built up well-protected submarine pens to shelter their U-boat fleet. Protected by up to 40 feet of reinforced concrete, these proved to be almost impregnable until they too were hit by Tallboy bombs dropped by Lancasters. It was to be a bomber that would hasten the end of World War II, the mighty Boeing B-29 Superfortress. The first B-29 raid against mainland Japan took place on the 15th of June 1944. 50 aircraft set off from bases in China. The long distance between China and Japan severely limited the bomb load of the B-29s. However, the first real blow had been struck against mainland Japan. The breakthrough occurred when the Marianas Islands were captured in mid-1944 and bases were set up on the islands. The shorter distance to Japan meant that the superfortresses could carry a much heavier bomb load. On the 9th of March 1945, Tokyo was hit for the first time since the courageous Doolittle raid by carrier-borne B-25s in 1942. In the following months, mainland Japan was hit by a number of devastating strikes. Tokyo itself was severely damaged in these fire raids. However, on the 6th of August 1945, a lone B-29 Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. 100,000 people were killed instantly, and the city was destroyed. The nuclear age had begun. On the 9th of August 1945, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The Japanese surrendered almost immediately. World War II was finally over. The B-29s had forced the surrender of the Japanese mainland without the need for a costly ground assault. Once again, air power proved to be decisive. By the end of the war, the strategic bomber offensive had turned Germany into the most heavily bombed country on Earth. In the words of the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the Third Reich had sown the wind. Now they shall reap the whirlwind. The bomber had come of age.